The sky above the 16th century town square was a canvas of sullen grey, mirroring the grim faces of the assembled townsfolk. At its heart stood the feared Witchfinder, Elias Thorne, his black robes a stark contrast against the rough-hewn wood of the pyre. Upon it, a young woman named Isolde was bound, her fate seemingly sealed. Thorne's voice, sharp and cold as a winter wind, cut through the tense silence. He proclaimed her a witch, a vessel of darkness responsible for the blighted crops and a recent plague of stillbirths. The crowd swayed to his words, a sea of fear and suspicion. On the periphery, Keir, a young inquisitor and Thorne's own apprentice, watched with a troubled brow, the certainty in his mentor's voice failing to quell the doubt in his own heart. Thorne reveled in the fear he commanded, but when he turned his gaze back to the condemned, he found no terror in Isolde's eyes. Instead, he was met with a look of profound, unnerving pity that pierced his armor of righteousness. It was a look that unmade him, turning his holy fury into a brittle, personal rage. "Burn the witch!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with an unholy fervor. He thrust his hand forward, a command to the waiting executioner. As the man advanced, the flame from his torch cast dancing, demonic shadows across the square, a prelude to the hellfire Thorne promised. But just as the torch neared the kindling at Isolde's feet, the very ground seemed to revolt. An unnatural, thick fog smelling of sulfur and ancient rot erupted from the cobblestones. It billowed upwards in a greasy black cloud, swirling with impossible speed until it completely engulfed the Witchfinder. The crowd's silent terror shattered into a cacophony of screams. They scattered in a blind panic, trampling one another to escape the suffocating mist. For a moment the fog churned violently, a localized storm of shadow and stench, before it thinned and dissipated as quickly as it had appeared. The pyre stood untouched, and Elias Thorne was gone. In the now empty square, only Keir, a few petrified guards, and the bound Isolde remained. A faint, knowing smile played on her lips. Drawn by an unseen force, Keir slowly approached the spot where his master had stood. There, lying on the damp stones, was Thorne's silver crucifix, now blackened and glowing with a faint, malevolent heat, as if seared from within. Keir picked it up, the unnatural warmth of the metal a stark confirmation of the impossible. He looked from the smoldering crucifix to the woman on the pyre. She had the answers. He now knew his true interrogation was about to begin. The heavy iron door groaned shut, plunging the stone cell into near-total darkness. A single torch flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Keir slammed his fist against the damp wall, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. "What did you do to him, witch?" he snarled, his voice raw with grief and rage. He faced Isolde, who sat calmly on a stone bench, the chains on her wrists glinting. She had been pulled from the pyre mere moments before it was lit. "Elias Thorne was not the righteous man you believed him to be," she said, her voice a soft, chilling whisper. "He was a man consumed by his own fear, a captain of the guard who craved the power of a king." Isolde's eyes unfocused, gazing into the past. "He was desperate," she explained, her voice weaving through the memories that now flickered like ghosts in the air. Desperate to purge the evil he saw in every shadow, in every face. A vision flashed, Thorne in a hidden chamber, kneeling before a crude altar, his face a mask of hope and terror. He etched a sigil with his own blood, chanting words in a forgotten tongue. To fight the monsters of the world, he made a pact with one far greater, far older than any he had ever hunted. The torchlight seemed to dim as a sudden unnatural cold seeped into the cell. The entity granted his wish, Isolde continued, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. It gave him the power to see the sin in every soul, to feel the darkness that lurks within men's hearts. But such power always comes with a price. She met Keir's glare, her eyes filled with a pity that cut him deeper than any blade. The price was his soul. What you saw in the square wasn't an attack. It was a collection. The entity simply came for what was owed. A low growl, like grinding stone, emanated from the darkest corner of the cell behind Keir. He froze, the hairs on his neck standing on end as a hulking, shadowy figure with burning embers for eyes began to coalesce from the blackness. "He is no longer Elias Thorne," Isolde whispered, her gaze fixed on the horror taking shape. "And he is still hungry. With a guttural roar, the monstrous remnant of Thorn lunged from the shadows directly at Keir. The entity's shriek was a razor-sharp sound in the confines of the cell, its claws gouging deep furrows in the ancient stone as it lunged. Keir reacted on pure instinct, shoving a heavy wooden stool into the creature's path. Without a second thought, he hurled his lit lantern. Flames erupted as the lantern shattered against the monster, and it recoiled with a guttural hiss, momentarily blinded. That single precious second was all Keir needed. He scrambled from the cell, slamming the heavy iron door shut behind him. The sickening thud of the bolt echoed in the silence, sealing the monster inside with the witch Isolde. He stood in the dark prison corridor, his breath ragged, clutching the blackened crucifix his mentor Thorn had given him. Every fiber of his being, every lesson from his training as an inquisitor, screamed at him to leave the witch to her fate and rally the guards. But the entity's guttural roars and the violent sounds of it battering the door were a terrifying symphony of destruction. Then, a gut-wrenching scream cut through the night, not from the cell, but from the nearby town square. A cold dread washed over Keir. The creature had found another way out. Keir stood conflicted before the cell door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was an inquisitor, a hunter of the dark, but this was something else entirely. He knew with chilling certainty that he couldn't face it alone. He had to make a choice, and there was only one that offered any hope of survival. Taking a deep, steadying breath, he unbolted the door and swung it open. The entity was gone. In the far corner, Isolde was crouched, shaken, but miraculously unharmed. Her eyes, filled with a grim knowledge, met his. "It will hunt you next," she whispered, her voice raspy. "You need me." He helped her to her feet, the cold stone of the prison floor feeling like a tomb around them. The once chaotic prison was now eerily silent. Keir looked at the woman he was supposed to condemn, his role as an inquisitor shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Where do we start?" he asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Isolde's gaze shifted towards the town, her expression hardening. "We don't start," she replied, her voice low and grim. "We hunt." As they stepped out of the cell together, another distant scream confirmed their new, unholy purpose. The fog clung to the desolate town streets like a shroud, muffling sound and breeding fear. Through the oppressive silence, Keir and Isolde moved as one, shadows hunting a greater darkness. "It feeds on this," Isolde whispered, her voice a fragile thread against the cold. "On fear, on hypocrisy, on the judgment that choked this town." She spoke of Thorn, the fallen inquisitor whose righteousness had become a poison. The entity was his legacy, a phantom drawn to the echoes of his tyranny. They followed its trail, a path of scorched earth and the lingering scent of terror, leading them inexorably toward the town's abandoned church, a monument to Thorn's twisted faith. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket of dread. The grand, cold church felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Here, they would set their trap. Keir took his place at the heart of the nave, a lone figure clutching Thorn's blackened crucifix. He began to recite prayers, his voice steady and clear, a beacon of defiant faith in the encroaching gloom. He was making himself the bait, a lure for the creature born of a corrupted soul. From the shadows of the choir loft, Isolde watched and waited, her own weapon at the ready, a piece of ancient knowledge she hoped would be the key to their survival. With a shriek that tore through the silence, the entity burst into the church. It was a maelstrom of shadow and rage, a vortex of despair drawn to Keir's challenge. The battle was immediate and desperate. Keir brandished the holy symbols, their silver light searing the creature's form. But the wounds did little to slow its relentless assault. The shadows coiled around him, tightening their grip, and his strength began to fail. Just as the entity loomed over him, ready to strike the final blow, Isolde emerged. She held no grimoire, no arcane artifact, but a simple iron bell, the one used to ring the death knell. She swung it with all her might, its toll ringing out furiously. The pure, somber tone of the bell struck the entity like a physical blow. It recoiled, shrieking in agony. This was the sound of finality, of acceptance, anathema to the twisted soul that refused to face its own judgment. The whirlwind of shadows unraveled, dissolving into a drift of fine ash. The blackened crucifix in Keir's hand cooled. its silver luster returning as if cleansed. As the first rays of dawn pierced the stained glass windows, they stood not as inquisitor and witch, but as survivors, bound by a terrible secret. Their long, arduous journey was far from over. If you enjoy horror stories, click follow, like, and subscribe, if you dare.